Hi, I'm Stephanie Metz. I'm a sculptor, and for nearly 20 years my main material has been wool, which I shape into sculptural forms through needle felting. The following is an excerpt from my Sculptural Needle Felting video workshop all about tools. You may know that needle felting involves poking at wool with a specialized needle a lot, but there's way more to it than that. In this video I explain what needle felting is and why it even works. I illustrate how to effectively and efficiently use felting needles, and I share my favorite multi-needle holders and work surfaces. Artists, makers, and hobbyists of all experience levels seek me out to learn about my approach because my work is known for being crisp, smooth, detailed, translucent, biomorphic, abstract, and just different. I push the limits of my material and technique, and I enjoy teaching what I've learned along the way. I know YouTube videos are supposed to be between 3 to 5 minutes long because it's assumed that we all have short attention spans and want quick fixes, but I'm more interested in being thorough. Needle felting takes time and attention, and so does learning about it. So, enjoy. First, let's talk about tools. The felting needle is the key to this whole thing. This sharp, small, serrated needle is what makes this all possible, thanks to its unique design. If you look close up at a felting needle, you see that there are notches cut in the edges, and it's those notches that snag on wool fibers and push them in the direction you're poking, tangling the fibers with their neighbors and then pulling out cleanly. It's pretty crazy. Felting is basically just matting hairs together, only what we're doing is trying to mat them in specific directions to build up mass where we want it. More people are familiar with wet felting. That's what happens when you take your favorite wool sweater and you throw it in the laundry and it comes out a tiny, stiff, dense, doll-sized sweater. Both wet felting and needle felting take advantage of the really unique properties of wool fibers themselves, only they come at it from different directions. Like the strands of human hair you see magnified in shampoo commercials, wool fibers are covered in overlapping scales. It's those scales that grab onto each other and create the tangling effect that makes the wool mass together. So there are two main methods for tangling wool into felt: wet felting and needle felting. Now, wet felting is not my area of expertise, but for a very, very brief, simple overview, it uses hot water to swell up those fibers and cause the scales to open up, and then adding soap changes the alkalinity and acts as a lubricant, and then a lot of agitation and handwork and pounding causes the fibers to curl against each other and grab on, and it removes air from the mix, and so with a lot of pounding and rubbing it seems to shrink as the fibers get closer and closer together. When you buy yardage of felt fabric, this is one of the ways that it's made commercially, only they use huge rollers and steam and a lot of pressure to make sheets of felt. That's why some felt like this is referred to as pressed felt. It's also called design felt to indicate that it's a much more dense and generally high quality product compared to craft felt. As you can see, it really has some body and a very smooth finish, but it's very much like a piece of fabric. In contrast, what we're doing really lends itself more to sculpture. We're using the felting needle to physically push the fibers around and build up mass. Although the felting needle was also originally made to make flat, even sheets of felt in a factory. The wool would be fed into the mouth of the machine where hundreds of these needles poke down repeatedly into matching holes below, almost like teeth chewing. The length of time in the machine and the amount of wool added results in different densities of industrial felt. Here's a piece of industrial felt. You can see the tracks of the needles across its surface, and you can also see that in its cross-section, the way the needles have plunged in to tangle the fibers. This kind of industrial felt is referred to as needled as opposed to pressed. It's a lot fluffier than the smooth pressed felt, but it's also got more body to it, kind of like a slab of rolled out clay. The use of felting needles tangles and compresses the fibers, but you're also building in a kind of structure. When you're needle felting, you're creating kind of a tiny matrix or armature of fibers going every which direction with a lot of air pockets trapped inside. You can add wool in any direction to build it up three-dimensionally, kind of like building up clay. Unlike clay, you can keep forcing more wool into the same small area to make an object more and more dense and able to hold its freestanding shape. I know you're probably pretty excited to start in with the needle felting already, and I'm excited to show you. But before that, let's talk about the tools a little more so you'll understand how to best use them. Back to the felting needle. There are several different types out there, and the differences all come down to their shape in cross-section and then their thickness or gauge. Now, they all have the same basic shape with the hook at the end, which fits into an industrial machine. But then the business end, the last about inch of it, is where you're going to find the differences. That's where it's sharp, and that's where the notches are cut. Here's my artist rendering showing the most common shapes of felting needles. The triangle needle has 3 edges that can have notches cut, while the star-shaped has 4 edges, and the spiral needle is like a triangle tip that's been twisted. The argument can be made that the star and spiral-shaped needles do the job quicker because they simply have more surfaces with notches to move the wool. I've always used triangle-shaped needles primarily, which seem to felt quite well. You can try all 3 and see if you have a preference. The size of the needle is referred to as its gauge. The higher the number, the finer the gauge, the smaller the diameter of the needle. They tend to range from 36, which is coarse, through 38, 40, and 42, which is fine. As the name implies, you would use a fine needle for really small, tiny, fine work, or if you're using really fine fibers. And then you'd use a coarser needle if you're working on roughing something out just at the beginning stages, something big, or if you're using coarser fibers. I will admit that I pretty much always use a 38 gauge triangle needle for just about everything. The exception is that when I'm working on small detailed things, I'll use a 40 gauge fine needle. It's difficult to easily see the difference between needles, although you can feel it when you poke into wool or when you run your finger along the shaft. Besides the gauge and the shape, I've also occasionally come across some that are longer or shorter than others. The only thing to keep in mind regarding the length is that if you're using a multi-needle holder with several needles in it at the same time, you definitely need them to be the same length. It can be hard to keep track of your different needles, so I know some people will physically mark them up with paint or nail polish to differentiate them. I tend to just keep mine in labeled baggies. When I first started out, I would just use a single needle held in my hand and start poking with that, which worked, but it ended up being pretty hard on my fingers and my hand and my wrist and my arm to be gripping something in such a pinchy, tight grip while also moving. So once I discovered multi-needle holders, there was no going back. Now, there are tons of different designs of these on the market. What they have in common is that they hold multiple needles and that they have kind of a different grip option for your hand. So even if you're only ever going to use a single needle, I still strongly recommend getting a handle for it because it's just going to be easier on your body. I'm going to show you a variety of multiple needle holders that I use. The 2 that I use most often are pretty standard and pretty basic, but I have multiple copies of them. That's because that allows me to have different quantities of needles and different arrangements of needles in them at any given time, and I can quickly move back and forth between tools. Even if it's the same tool, the fact that there are more needles closer or farther apart makes them act like a different tool. Multiple needle holders are great because they can hold lots of needles. And you'd think more needles equals faster felting. That's true, but only in very particular situations, like when you're working very thin and flat, so all the needles can enter the fiber perpendicular to its surface, and the mass of fiber isn't so thick that it offers much resistance. A lot of needles really close together actually act kind of like a unit. Like a bed of nails, they distribute the pokiness, and none of them poke in very far, they just work together to push the whole mass. When felting needles are spaced farther apart, they're able to actually penetrate the mass of wool, tangle fibers with each other, and really get some felting done. So needles spread further apart can be good, but it's also really important for all the needles to go straight in and out of the mass of fiber. That means you need to scale the footprint of your tool, the outline of your needle arrangement when you look at it from the tip end, to the size of what you're working on, so the needles in your holder can all go straight in like this. This footprint of needles is too big for the size of the felt. They can't all go in perpendicular. You can always go too small, but if your needle footprint spreads out too far, you're likely to bend and break some of the needles. Felting needles are strong, but they're also brittle, and sideways force can snap them. In a lot of cases, it's good to make your felt pretty dense, but that means the felt itself can exert force on your needles. When the footprint of your needles is too wide, it's more likely that some of them will bend off to the side instead of penetrating the felt. When they bend, they can also break. Additionally, I often see people poking into wool and somehow trying to turn a corner, which will also break them. No one wants super sharp needle tips to go flying through the air or get embedded inside something that was supposed to be a soft and huggable toy. So the way you set the number and location of your needles inside your multi-needle holder matters. It may seem like I'm spending a lot of time talking about the arrangements and types of needles, but there's a reason why I harp on this and why I begin this workshop talking about tools. Regardless of the activity, be it needle felting or cooking or brain surgery, you have to really understand your tools in order to use them effectively, efficiently, and safely. You may have learned needle felting from a kit and you know that you should poke straight in with the needle, but that's just the beginning. To do this effectively, efficiently, and safely, you need to really understand that the difference in size of needles and the quantity of needles you use and the distance between them really makes a big difference. Here's a visual breakdown. The smaller the needle size, the closer together you can place the needles and still have them penetrate the wool. The bigger or coarser the needle, the farther apart they should be if you want them to really poke in. You might not want to hear this, but a single lone needle is almost always the most effective at either surface detail work or deep poking shaping work. But for efficiency, you want to use more than one needle. Only if too many needles are too close together, they work against you. So how do you figure out a good balance? How do you make it work in both efficiency and effectiveness? Think of it this way. There's an imaginary circle of tangling around a felting needle which gets wider depending on the gauge of the needle. For a fine 40 gauge needle, the circle is about 1/8 of an inch or 3 millimeters wide. For a medium 38 gauge needle, that circle expands to about 1/4 of an inch or 6 millimeters wide. For a coarse 36 gauge needle, that circle grows to about 1/2 an inch or 12 millimeters wide. That means to be at their most effective position for poking deeper into the wool for shaping, you want to place them no closer than a circle of tangling away from each other. It's pretty handy that most of the ready-made multi-needle holders are already designed that way. If you position the needles too close together and have too much overlap between their circles of tangling, I should trademark that, they tend to work together as a unit, that bed of nails effect, and they will only penetrate in a shallow way. That can be good when you're working more at the surface, but when you're trying to initially tame loose wool into a cohesive mass, it's more useful to poke deeply into the wool. Here's the thing, if you use more than one needle, but position them so that they're far enough apart that their circles of tangling don't overlap, then you can get the effectiveness of the single needle multiplied by the efficiency of more than one needle. But keep in mind, you have to keep them pretty far apart, so this doesn't work that well for really small things. But you'll often see me starting to rough out a form using a single needle or two pretty far apart, because it really is a good balance of efficiency and effectiveness. In the coursework, I've created printable documents showing a visual explanation of what I've just described. I think a lot of frustration in needle felting happens when there's a mismatch between the understanding of the tools and the goals of the felter. So if you're trying to really shape something but you're using a lot of really fine needles, it might seem like nothing's happening no matter how much you poke at it. Or if you're trying to add tiny details but using a coarse needle, you might end up just obliterating the thing you're trying to add on. Really understanding the tools means trying different gauges of needles and trying different arrangements so you understand really well what it feels like to use them, and it'll become more instinctual to know what to use in different situations. And that will make your needle felting more efficient and effective, and it'll make you safer because you'll be less likely to stab yourself or break your needles. So let's get down to why I like these particular multi-needle holders. This first one, the Colonial Felting Tool 2, is a simple wooden handle that screws together to insert and remove the needles, which are held in place by being pressed between the wood layers. This version 2 has 12 holes. There's also a version 1 with 6 holes. I like this 12-hole version because it means I have a lot of options of where to put my needles and how big or small of a footprint I can have. I don't think I've ever used it with all 12 needles, since I don't tend to work on thin, flat objects. There are a few downsides to this tool. As you can see from these 3 different ones, there's not a ton of consistency in the manufacture of these holders. That's true in the pattern of the holes, but also in the drilling of the holes. They're frankly not always parallel. That can be a problem if you do want to use a lot of the holes at the same time, since you definitely want your needles to be parallel. But for the way I use these, the benefits outweigh the drawbacks. I usually have a tool set up with 1 needle, with 2, and with 3. So I pick and choose which holes to use. I try to preserve my hand, wrist, and arm health by using large muscle groups instead of small whenever possible. And so with this tool, I can hold it just in my fingertips and do a little bit more wrist action if I'm doing small or careful detail work, or I can shift my grip and hold it more in the palm of my hand and use a lot more of my arm muscles. Now, this does take a little bit of time to open and close and switch around the needles, which is why I keep multiple ones around. But if I had only one tool, this is the tool that I would get, because it just has such a great variety of uses for me. I should also note that if you or someone you know who owes you a favor have some basic woodworking skills and access to tools, you can make this kind of multi-needle holder using the things you could find at a local hardware store. The handle itself could be a drawer pull. The part that you drill the holes in could be either a little pre-made wooden wagon wheel or just a little circle of wood. Just make sure you drill your holes truly parallel. And then they have little threaded inserts so you could attach the piece together. You could also get really fancy and turn a very custom handle on a lathe, and you could determine exactly where you want your footprint of holes to be. Sky's the limit, but it also comes down to time and energy and all that stuff, which is why I just buy them off the shelf. Since I'm working with a lot of different needle holders, I like to keep a piece of foam on my work table, and I use that as a place to poke in any of the needles that I'm not using. It's a way to keep track of them, and if you store them just on your tabletop, it's easy for the holders to roll off and hit the ground and break your needles, or even worse, land needle side down in your lap or on your foot. I've also seen people just leave them on the tabletop with the needle side up, which it just makes me cringe because I imagine how easy it would be to place your hand on top of them. I've built in some habits for not getting stabbed over the years, and I will continue to share those with you. Moving on, the other tool I find myself using most often is the Clover pen-style needle tool. This is really good for small, detailed work. It comes with 3 fine needles, and as the name implies, it's shaped like a pen, which means it's really familiar and easy to hold in your hand and get a lot of control when you're doing detail. This is really easy to open. You just unscrew the handle part, and needles slot really neatly into place here. So you can take out 2 of them, leaving just 1, or work with 2 or 3. And then if you need to expose more of the needle so you can felt more deeply, you can just take off this tip part. This comes with a cap, which is really handy if you need to travel with it. And it also has a little attachment to use with these cookie cutter forms to make flat work with felt, which I've never used. Now, I tend to keep several of these on hand, just like with the wooden tools, because I keep one with a single fine needle, one with a more coarse needle, and then generally one with 2 needles for when I'm doing linear work and I want to have one needle follow in the path of the other. I also sometimes keep 3 fine needles when I'm doing small detail work, but if you were to choose only one tool and you want to do this one, I would also get some more coarse needles to go with it, so maybe some 38 gauge to go along with these fine gauge ones, so you could switch those out and move a little bit more felt a little quicker at the beginning stages. Now, when I'm using multiple versions of the same tool, I also like to mark these so it's easy to grab them. So for this one that has a single needle that's fine, I just make a little dot and single dots to mark the end. And then for the one that has a more coarse needle, I make a thicker dot, and again I mark the sides. And then for the one that has 2, I just make 2 little dots. It just makes it easier to grab them out of my holder when I need them, since especially with the fine and the coarser needles, you can't really see the difference that well. Now I have a couple more that I'd like to show you as well. This is the Ashford Student Felting Needle Punch. It's plastic and therefore lightweight. It comes with 3 coarse 36 gauge needles, and it has kind of an unusual feature. You can actually store the needles inside the handle by unscrewing the lid, taking this nickel-sized metal disc out of the throat of the tool and placing it in the lid, and then sliding the needles back inside the tool and closing it up. Like the other tools, you can work with this with just 1 or 2 needles by taking some of them out. Although you can't store the needles inside the handle and use the tool at the same time. It's not long enough to accommodate the length of the needles. Now this also has a little bit of a limited footprint of where the needles are arranged, although honestly it's pretty similar to the wooden tool that I use, so it's not a problem for me. Again, the handle's lightweight, it's kind of long, it's pretty comfortable for your hand, but unlike the wooden tool, you can't just grab it in your palm and transfer that motion from your wrist to your arm as well, so that's a little bit of a drawback. I do find that most of my workshop students end up buying this tool, I think because of the storage ability as well, but they'll get a few different kinds of needles to go with it, so it's not just the 36 coarse ones. And I've seen that Ashford, this company, also makes a really elegant wood-turned version of this, also with the hollow handle. So that's another option. And then speaking of wooden tools, this is the first one that I ever found. It's elegant and beautiful and feels pretty nice in my hand, but it's kind of heavy and the needles are spaced a little bit farther apart than is handy sometimes. This can hold up to 5 needles. I usually use about 4. And I use it mostly for roughing out beginnings of forms or working on larger forms. This one also opens by unscrewing and sliding the needles into holes. And with this one, I found that it rattled a little bit. The needles weren't sandwiched in there very tightly, so I just made myself a little felt washer to push them in a little bit more tightly. I don't know the maker of this one. It was years and years ago, but there are a lot of different ones out on the market, and you may already have your favorites. I talk a lot about the weight and the grip and the feel of the different tools because this is a repetitive action, and awkwardly gripping something that's too heavy or just feels weird in your hand can feel pretty bad over time. I'll talk a little bit more about that soon in the safety and comfort section. But for now, you may try a couple different tools, decide on what you like, and you might even accumulate a collection like I have. Now let's talk about work surfaces, because you're going to be poking into and through the wool, and you don't want to be poking into your tabletop. So there are 2 main work surfaces that I prefer. The first good option is a foam pad. This is expressly marketed as a felting surface, but it's just a piece of foam rubber. It's a nice density, it's a pretty handy size, although if you wanted to work much bigger, you could go to a craft store and get a really big piece of foam. You can also use a lot of different kinds and colors of foam. You just got to see what works for you. I like that this is the dark gray color because it's really nice contrast to the white wool that I'm usually using, so I can really see what I'm working on well. One downside is that it can break down over time. So the more you poke into it, the more you're kind of collapsing the little bubbles that make up the foam rubber. And it'll get a little bit squishier over time. Short term, you can just turn it over and use the other side. But if you do it for too long, little bits of the actual foam may come loose and get embedded in what you're working on, which is generally not what you want. There's also another maybe downside to this, which is that it makes a very distinctive sound when you poke into it. It can be a very satisfying and soothing sound when you're the one poking into it, but for someone else in the room with you forced to listen, it could be torturous. Now, when you're needle felting, you're going to make some repetitive, crunchy sounds anyway, so it's probably not that big of a deal. But the other thing to notice about this foam pad is that it's kind of bouncy. So the whole surface is a little bit squishy, and when I'm working on it, my hand's bouncing a little bit. And I've been told that as far as ergonomics and repetitive stress, that's not great. Haven't seen any literature about it, but it's something to keep in mind. Overall, this is a really useful work surface. It's economical, it's a good size. I like that there's the contrast between the color of the wool and the background that I can show you when I'm demonstrating. But I will say that when I'm not demonstrating, the tool that I'm mostly using as a work surface is this one. This is the Clover Large Brush Mat. It's called large, but that's only in contrast to the small, which is half this size. It's basically, effectively, a scrub brush with really close together even bristles. And it's used to suspend the felt off the hard surface underneath so that you can poke through and into it. It's marketed primarily as something that you can use to embellish, to add flat details to other flat things, but it totally works for needle felting as well. And what I like about this is that it does not have that bouncy surface. It kind of feels like it holds what I'm working on more firmly and more steadily. And it doesn't bounce. It doesn't have that same crunch sound, for whatever that matters. And I like that it just feels like what I'm working on, especially when I'm working really small, is not moving on me the way it does sometimes with the foam pad. Now this is pretty small. Tends to work for what I'm doing, but several years ago I tried making myself a jumbo-sized brush mat surface by gluing 12 scrub brushes upside down on a piece of plywood. And it did work as intended. It's a big surface, it allows me to, manipulate and work on larger things, but it's big and unwieldy, it's heavy, and I ended up leaning or touching my forearms against the bristles so much as I worked, it got incredibly physically irritating. And since then, the very large felt sculptures I've worked on lately are such big masses that I don't really need a work surface that's that big. When the piece you're working on is so large, you're not going to poke through it into the table. So I may use that brush mat again sometime, but it's not really that useful. But you get the idea, I think. If you wanted to replicate this with a scrub brush, you would just want to make sure that the bristles are set really closely together so that it's a really even surface that can support what you're working on, and that they're not too long, because then they might kind of bend over more and again not be supportive. The one downside with this brush mat, besides the fact that it's fairly small, is that this surface, the brush surface, can kind of catch on the felt surface as you're working and make your piece really fluffy. Could be a good thing if you want that to happen on purpose. But if you're working on something small and detailed and you don't want that fluffy surface, but you do want this firm support, you could just take a piece of craft felt and lay it over top and use that as a barrier so that it has the same positive effects without fuzzying up your outsides. Generally speaking, this is the work surface that I reach for the most often. But keep in mind that for me, I'm usually working either so big that I don't need a work surface or very small. The last kind of useful tools I want to talk about are cutting tools. You will definitely hear me talking about shaping and manipulating felt by cutting, which is not considered cheating. And a good pair of scissors can go a long way for this, especially if they're sewing scissors or scissors that have not otherwise been dulled by members of your family cutting paper with them. A couple of years ago, a good friend introduced me to these Kai tailoring shears, which are incredible. They're really very strong. They're the Kai 7250s. They are a little bit heavier and bigger than most scissors you will use, but they can cut through this 3/8 of an inch thick felt with ease, which is pretty amazing. And then besides scissors, I like to have a utility knife or a box cutter on hand. These are just useful for all sorts of different cuts. And I like the kind with the breakaway blades because you can always have a fresh, sharp blade, and wool will definitely dull your blades pretty quickly, surprisingly enough. And I like also to use it in the ill-advised way of extending the blade out pretty far sometimes so I can kind of bend with it a little bit. I'll show you some examples of that when I talk about armatures. And keep in mind to use safety. I'll occasionally have need for a pair of pliers or a sewing needle or tweezers for different projects, but I'll talk about those as they come up. For now, if you don't have any of these tools, I suggest starting with 5 to 10 of the 38 gauge needles, and you might also be interested in a variety pack that lets you try out the different gauges from fine through coarse, so about 42 up through 36, as well as the spiral tip, triangle tip, and star tip, just to see what they feel like. I also strongly recommend that you get a handle or a multi-needle holder. Even if you only picture yourself using a single needle to work on teeny tiny things, remember that it's hard on your body to pinch and move a single needle. So if you're going to work on pretty small things like the size of your fist, I think that the pen style tool could be all that you need. But if you're going to work any larger than that, I really like the variability of having the different holes and the different places you can put needles in these larger multi-needle holders like the Colonial wood style or the Ashford plastic one. I have no vested interest in what tool you get or what needles you get. I just want you to try things out and find what works best for you. So besides the handle, you're also going to need a foam rubber work surface or a brush mat to work on, and then a pair of sharp scissors, and you'll be in business. Now, I've provided a list of places where you can find these specific tools as well as other ones. A lot of them are online. I prefer brick and mortar local stores whenever possible, but these are pretty specialized tools, so you might not be able to do that. There are also a lot of sellers on places like Etsy that specialize in these, and they're smaller shop owners if that's important to you. Before you go shopping though, the next section we're going to talk about materials, so in our case wool. So we're going to go over the different kinds of wool and about how much you might need to start out. So before you do your shopping, let's go to the next section. Thanks for watching. Leave a comment to let me know if this helped you or if you have any further questions about the tools of needle felting. If you're looking for the complete workshop, you can find it online at courses.stephaniemetz.com.